In kindergarten, there was a boy named Tyler who would make fun of me. He would follow me around, teasing me to elicit some type of reaction. And for me, that was to be quite upset. That was 12 years ago, and yet I still distinctly remember it. Those moments of bullying, whether they're as small as another kindergartner calling you names or to further extremes, always stick with you. I'm sure everyone in this very room can recall a comment such as that. One said to you even countless years ago that still might sting a little bit. Years of hearing snarky, rude, and straight-up malicious comments directed towards me and the people around me fueled a desire to initiate change. So as a personal project, I created anti-bullying lessons for grades 1 through 3, aimed at informing and guiding children to understand and target bullying in their own lives. I believe it is of the utmost importance so that in these foundational years of establishing their beliefs, morals, and values, children can develop a strong sense of what's right and wrong. During my lessons, there was one moment that really stood out to me. When the kids were doing their worksheet, I would go around and talk to them. During this time, many of them would open up to me, and I'd heard a vast collection of stories from the children, each sharing their own impactful experiences. One boy in particular had mentioned he was frequently a victim of being pushed around. When I'd asked if he had told a teacher, he stopped for a moment to ponder. Looking up at me, almost confused, he replied earnestly, "But I don't want to be a Petze." For those of you who don't know, in German, that roughly translates to snitch, narc, or tattletale. He, already as an 8-year-old boy, was so concerned at the social consequences that would arise from telling a teacher. But how do we get to that point in our lives that we're so scared to tell someone about something so serious going on in fear of repercussions? And after asking myself that question, it clicked. Throughout all of history, I've seen this phenomenon countless times, repeated in varying levels of power. What is the one thing in our minds that makes us think this way? The answer to that is basic psychology. In our normal lives, we tend to forget that a frequent human drive and motivator is power. Power through influencing others, taking control, and remaining in control. Consistently, psychological research has indicated that power easily corrupts people, altering their sense of morality and empathy for others. I mean, who's surprised? Yet, thinking back historically, we can start to see a lot of situations where this comes up, most notably under totalitarian regimes. Now, please bear with me. I promise this isn't too far of a jump. Think about it. A totalitarian leader sacrifices the necessities of others in their pursuit of power, forcing others into situations that are dehumanizing and demoralizing. What do childhood bullies do? It is also their goal to demoralize their victim, to establish themselves above others in the social hierarchy. That same social hierarchy is dependent on the power that people obtain over others. Yet before I delve deeper, I do want to preface that by no means do I want to directly compare the horrifying atrocities that have occurred in totalitarian regimes when we can still see their impacts echoing in our societies today. Instead, I want to draw light on how impactful the basic psychology of humans can be and how it can be applied on varying scales. Think of the power discrepancies that both bullies and totalitarian leaders create. Dissecting their goals and stripping them down to their bare essence and meaning, you start to see parallels in the way that each achieve their goals. All right, now let's delve a little deeper into power. To obtain power over others in a social hierarchy, you need a group. Because what type of person are you if you don't have a group to support you? A collective is required to put other people down because it sure takes a lot of work to create and instill that type of fear into people. Someone working alone is never entirely successful. I mean, it's a grim perspective to take on teamwork. Let me provide you with an example. The Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or the Nazis, were the first political party that gave Hitler a notable podium to speak on. Without it, his uber-nationalistic ideas would not be able to garner so much support throughout post-World War I plagued Germany. The role that the Nazis played were invaluable in Hitler's swift rise in his political career. Now, let's flash back to primary school for a moment and think about some of the typical roles you can find in a bullying scenario. You have the bully, the victim, the upstander, but most notably, the bystander. That form of complicity of a person can only be achieved by certain means. Power. It's that fear of repercussions from the leader that makes that survival instinct kick in. Not fight or flight, but instead burying your head in the sand. Because it is easier in these extreme situations just to follow along with the group. No need to make any decisions by yourself when you have that leader behind you making them for you. No need for critical thought when you are the majority. You aren't the victim, and that becomes enough for you. Sigmund Freud discussed this in his book, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. Yet instead of phrasing it as burying your head in the sand, he labeled it the much more eloquent phenomenon of contagion. He detailed this very spectacle of how in group settings, things become easier to believe. Whether it be ideas, emotions, or attitudes, they spread so much easier. It is so easy to forfeit our individuality, to quell that natural human desire of wanting to conform the collective. Sorry, please excuse me, it's been a long day. All right, so now let's apply this to a school setting. A lot of the time in a school, this is labeled peer pressure, and this is where the more subtle forms of bullying come into play. That yawn right there, sorry, I was waiting for it. See how easily you subconsciously repeat these behaviors? Just because I was standing up on this very stage with all attention on me, and see how easy it was to influence you? Even if it was just something as small and insignificant as a yawn, it spread so quickly. Think of this. It might start as something tiny and minor, yet in the grand scheme of things, that's when we start to see the problems arise. All right, now let's actually move back to the school setting. These subtle forms of bullying are the ones that really mess with your mind and stick with you until this day. Think back to the beginning of this talk, to that one comment that still might be a little bit tender. Maybe it was that one girl saying something like, "Oh, you're eating that much," or someone else calling you weak. Because of this, a cult-like group is then established around that bully. No one wants to become the next victim, so you become the accomplice. Freud also has his own explanation for this, called familial affiliation. In this, he described two roles, the father figure and the rest. He described this father figure as somebody with more easily subjected morals. This is exactly what a bully can be. They have this flexible set of morals, and they can easily justify their treatment of others in their own somewhat skewed perspective. See, a lot of the time, we also think of father figure as a somewhat more dominant, disciplining, and authoritative figure, and that is also what exactly a bully can be. Thinking back, throughout Stalin's regime, he liked to actually portray himself as a father figure, a happy family man. Posters of him show him standing and smiling next to children, a kind and loving man. Yet we all know this wasn't the case. Instead, it was a deflecting facade to try and paint him in a different light than the ruthless, cruel, and despotic leader that he was. It's pretty interesting how he directly exhibits this very phenomenon as a bully. Yet before we only label someone as just a bully or just a victim, we do need to remember that you can be both. Being a bully or a victim isn't a set of binary oppositions. Instead, they are often quite closely interlinked. We take our behaviors from our environment and project them and put them into other situations. Sometimes unhealthy ideas can be normalized in someone, and they can project these ideas onto others. I mean, Stalin, as a child, was intensely bullied for facial scarring he had contracted due to having smallpox at a young age. In all of his pictures and posters, you can see that they're edited out. Mao was bullied for his peasant background, labeled as rural and unsophisticated in comparison to the rest of his privileged classmates. You can see that his political ideology has deep roots in socialism and communism, achieved through increasingly violent means. Hitler was physically bullied by his father, beaten in attempts to achieve complicity, yet that only pushed him in the opposite direction. Are you starting to see the patterns that can form? A lot of the time, those behaviors that we learn from our younger selves stick with us when growing up. Yet sometimes they manifest themselves oppositely as we get older. It's an odd way to try and evolve as a person. Yet, by no means am I implying that being severely bullied at a young age will push people to such horrifying extremes. Instead, I want you to reflect on how you mentally depict a bully. Remember that a lot of the time, it comes from these psychological facets that are deeply ingrained and hardwired into all of our brains. So, if you want to imagine that high school bully pushing smaller misfits against lockers, or playing mind games with the main characters, go ahead. But just remember that you need to understand this issue. Because these bullies have this set of psychological influences that are consistent. These mental influences make no one want to mess with them. No one want to be their next victim, but most interestingly enough, no one want to tell on them. So thinking back to that 8-year-old boy, can you really blame him for not wanting to tell the teacher? That insurmountable issue he faced without ever learning how to deal with and cope with bullying, that's such a hard position to be in. So for the last time, think back to your own situation or instance. It still might sting a little, it still might hurt a little, and that's perfectly fine. But reflecting on it now, would you change anything how you reacted? Thank you.